Okay, I think we're live. Hello everybody. Welcome to the second live event in our webinar series, Crisis Education, Critical Education, Toolkit for Connected Learning. I'm here with our guests for Module 2, which is called Approaches, Art, Practice, Otherwise. And this webinar was initiated by Nishant Shah as part of his professorship in Aesthetics and Cultures of Technology at Artes University. But it comes more out of a field-wide realization that a focus on technological platforms and going online isn't enough to produce meaningful educational experiences. If we focus too much on the technology, we are going to end up reducing education to something that we might not all be satisfied with. And we want to try to start an open dialogue where we can take a step back from the rush to purchase software licenses and try to understand this shift, what is happening, and to try to reevaluate our needs as educators, as students, as organizers. So that's where the title comes from. So crisis education, critical education. We're trying to shift the response from a kind of crisis response to more of a critical discussion that can lead to positive action. So with this webinar, we're really not intending to create a comprehensive understanding of what's at stake here, but we're just scratching the surface, and we're very aware of that. But we hope that by having these discussions in a open way where we're sharing stories and asking questions together, we can move towards creating a toolkit that sketches out the possibilities we have for doing things differently as educators, as students, and as organizers. So in this module, we're very happy to have a very diverse group of practitioners, educators, community builders, and artists to discuss specific approaches and tactics. And together we want to reflect on what we can learn from these individual experiences going forward. So I'm very pleased to introduce the guests for this module, Soo Ryon Yoon, Kat Braybrooke, Sarah Allen, and Winnie Soon, who have generously shared their time and individual experiences with us in these modules videos. And you can view the past videos in the links below. We'll also be monitoring the chat room during this live stream. So please, if you're viewing this and you have questions or comments, do share them in the chat. We'll be watching them and responding to them. So to start with, I want to give a little bit more introduction of our guests. So Dr. Soo Ryon Yoon is an assistant professor in performance and cultural studies in Lingnan University in Hong Kong. Her research concerns racial politics and contemporary performance in South Korea. Her writings on performance, Koreanness, racial politics, and sexuality are published or forthcoming in Inter-Asia Cultural Studies, Performance Research, GPS, Global Performance Studies, the 2019 Venice Biennale catalog for the Korean Pavilion, and Positions Asia critique, among others. Soo Ryon is currently working on her monograph, Choreographing Affinities, Blackness, Koreanness, and Performing Race in South Korea, which investigates the circulation of African diasporic dance in South Korea in the global Afro-Asian context. She completed her PhD as a Fulbright Fellow in Performance Studies at Northwestern University and was a CEAS postdoctoral associate at Yale University. So thank you, Soo Ryon, for being here. Kat Braybrooke is a digital anthropologist, designer, and director of Studio We and Us, which I'm probably pronouncing wrong. So sorry, Kat. Who studies the dynamics of creative communities, from hackers to crafters across physical and virtual terrains. She also explores how collective spaces, from museums to maker spaces, can harness cultural heritage in ways that foster social and ecological transformation, and how collective action is associated with hacks or shifts in a society's status quo. She spent the last decade leading co-design and curatorial projects for the global communities of third sector and open technology in organizations, including Mozilla, the Open Knowledge Foundation, and many more. She's done extensive ethnographic research with makerspaces and free software communities internationally. And she's currently a research fellow with the Horizon 2020 funded project Creatures, which examines how creative practices foster sustainable development. And she's also a visiting researcher at the King's College London Department of Digital Humanities. So thank you, Kat, for being here. Sarah Allen is a community organizer and event producer, best known for being the director of MozFest, which is one of the largest international gatherings of practitioners working towards open and fair technologies for a healthier internet. This annual event brings together an international and extremely diverse set of communities, including artists, activists, technologists, and policymakers. It is kind of a part arts festival, part tech and society gathering, part maker festival, and is the premier gathering for activists in diverse global movements fighting for a more humane digital world. As the director and producer of MozFest for the past 6 years, Sarah has worked tirelessly to develop the infrastructure and the social codes necessary for MozFest to become a vehicle rather than a destination. So it's a massive undertaking, and it's owned, designed, and operated in part by the community itself, and one that prides itself on creating flashpoints for collective action based on the real needs and the ideas of this community. So thank you very much, Sarah, for being with us. And finally, Winnie Soon is a Hong Kong arts researcher and educator who is currently based in Denmark, where she is assistant professor in the Department of Digital Design at Aarhus University. Her artworks and her research deal with topics around computational culture, and in particular regard to automated censorship, erasure, query data, real-time processing, liveness, invisible infrastructures, and the aesthetics of code. Her projects have been presented and exhibited internationally at museums, art festivals, libraries, universities, and conferences. And her current research focuses on critical technical and feminist practice. She's working on 2 open source books. One is called Aesthetic Programming, a handbook of software studies, which she is making together with Jeff Cox. And the second is called Fix My Code, which she is making with Cornelia Solfrank. So thank you, Winnie, for being here. Yeah, and finally, I guess I should say who I am. My name is Jonathan Roos. I'm mainly a composer working on fundamental art and media research. I've also often worked in education, mainly producing ground up community initiatives such as the Instrument Inventors Initiative in The Hague, the Reading Room, which has been kind of a collective study initiative that's been nomadic for the last year or so within the Netherlands, and the Netherlands Coding Live community, which is a community of artists in the Netherlands working with live coding practices. I've also done work in traditional institutional educational settings, such as at the University of Leuven, where I helped design a practice-based curriculum for the major digital media. It's also where I first met Nishant, one of the co-producers of this webinar series. And I'm based in The Hague, but originally from the United States. So thank you, me, for being here.
Yes.
So yeah, let's get started. So yeah, again, everybody, thank you so much for being here. It's so wonderful that you dedicated your time to this moment. I really want to start by just saying how excited I am about the diversity of the perspectives we have in this group and the diversity of perspectives introduced in your videos. I especially love that we have this connection of people who are deep in education versus people who are more deep into community organizing. And I think there's a lot of similarities here that we can kind of try to make and make bridges between these 2 fields. So I want to start maybe by asking a question to everybody, and then we can kind of go one by one, almost like a panel, and see what you think in response to this question. And it's kind of maybe a provocative question. So there have been discussions within educational circles for a year on this idea of the university in decline. So this idea of the university as a space for equality and independent thought is kind of under attack. And it's led some to announce the death of the university altogether. And it seems from the stories you've presented that everybody is kind of working without real institutional or physical infrastructure. And this becomes especially kind of transient or not transient, salient when you start looking at arts education practices where fundamental things like performance spaces, rehearsal spaces, workshops, things like this are no longer available to students. And students often attend and pay for art schools to have access both to training but also to infrastructure, these physical spaces where matters of aesthetics and interpersonality can be kind of made and worked through. So I wonder if some of you think um, that through this moment that we're in right now, are we announcing the kind of official death of the arts university? And maybe to be a little bit less polemic, what do you see this transformation leading to going forward? And can even a traditional arts education go on as it was before? Um, yeah, I know this is a lot of questions, so whatever you can take from it, please. I'm really looking forward to your responses. Soo Ryon, maybe we can start with you. How do you respond to this?
Sure. I guess right off the bat, I wouldn't necessarily agree with the speculation that this is the end of what it is of the arts education in general context. I think the premise is that perhaps we're thinking of the arts education in a more, sort of narrower sense. That is, very sort of in a narrower sense, infrastructure or support has to have this like studio space, workshop stages, lightings, technical managers. All of these are, while extremely important to sustaining what we have been exposed to, the forms and terms of arts education that has been, in practice for centuries. Perhaps I think this particular moment also kind of prompts us to think at a very different dimension of what arts education must be, especially in terms of how at this point when, for example, the government in Hong Kong, for example, puts a lot of emphasis on elite art education, and it is actually sort of ready to kind of support arts infrastructural support if the university kind of requires that. But at the same time, it only supports these ideas when they only kind of are amenable to or accommodate a particular agenda or profit-making prospects of arts education. And so I think at this point, I don't think it's about the death necessarily, but rather kind of the movement towards a very different dimension, very different kind of step in terms of innovating and re-articulating the concerns that we've had in the conventional arts education. I don't want to say cleansing because it kind of assumes, right? It's very like dystopic, but perhaps I think, and I was kind of talking or thinking a lot about the body's resilience and persistence in this time of difficulty, in this time of uncertainty. And so I think that kind of value actually prompts us to rethink about the current forms and types of practices or values that we take for granted within the arts education. So I'm on the fence, about kind of declaring, announcing the death of arts education in higher education system. But it kind of gives the moment to kind of really contemplate, really kind of re-articulate my own concerns about this particular crisis.
Mm.
Yeah, so we could probably build our conversation around that as well.
Mm. Maybe I'll also ask Winnie, because you're also working very actively in a education institution, but of course in a different context. Soo Ryon, you were saying in your video that I mean, in Hong Kong, you've been dealing with this kind of remote education situation since November already because of the student protests. And so there's a very different sort of cultural context than maybe, Winnie, what you would encounter in Denmark, where you're teaching. So I'm very curious what your feelings are, both about this question of, is the Art Academy dead? Or is the Art University dead because of this removal of sort of physical infrastructure? But also, how do you see the cultural context your students being specific in how they're dealing with this situation?
I guess there are a few different things here because in Denmark is a very different setup in terms, I think maybe similar to Netherlands, because the art academy and research-based university are quite separated in a way. So I'm more speaking from the perspective in a research-based university and also sort of like observing different art academy institutions, how they respond to this. And our lockdown haven't been really that long when compared with Yongsu in Hong Kong, which is more like, I guess, around 2 months. And there is a plan to reopen actually this week. So there's actually a lot of, like admin logistic need to plan ahead on how to reopen. What does it mean by reopen? And to what extent there are some kinds of infrastructural changes, right? And first of all, I do not agree as well, like in terms of the death of the art university. There are a few things I feel like there's a difference in a sense, like if things are being reopened, right, then are we going back to the normal, right? That's the what are the new normal that we are expecting, right? But also a lot of discussion around is like how to, I guess also this webinar, web seminar is also around thinking around how to facilitate connections and different hacking and intervention and tools with the use of network technologies and infrastructure as well, right, as part of the discussion. And I really like Yoon-Soo talk about like what are the things that we have been taken for granted, and especially for me, because I have been usually working within the screen, I have to say, and even I'm a software artist, so I mostly deal with programming, computer, and sometimes it's installation. But because from my practice and my background, born and raised in Hong Kong, and I think you also mentioned about the space in Hong Kong is such a small space. There's no luxury for me to think about installation work with space, right? So that's why my practice is I see computer is my space, is my private space and creative space in that sense. But I do see like there are a lot of things, not necessarily arts, but I mean in terms of like overall education learning setting, this kind of the forgetfulness of the importance of materiality, both in terms of the bodies and also in terms of like technological, like projector, like physical space, the table, like the chairs, how they arrange, and all whiteboard, right? Although we have whiteboard on Zoom, but it's totally different. And we need to know this is different. And it's not, I'm not championing in a way like everything has to be translated or transformed on like online setting, which is equal the same old normal. We need to acknowledge the fact that it's different. Now it's a temporary situation, and we might able to find new challenges and new transformation emerge. But I think it's like there's this moment of time to rethink about what is important and how our education might change, but it's not like erase all the important parts of us education.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, maybe I'll move to Sarah. So I think in MOSFest, you're always being confronted with this sort of hybridity of a global digital community, and then how to make that physical. So in a sense, I get the impression, I mean, when I went to MOSFest last time, I got the impression that it's almost like you're trying to create a momentary physical infrastructure for something. So it's almost you've been working with this challenge already, which is the challenge that most universities are going to be facing as they return to some sort of new normal, which is kind of like having gone into the matrix and then coming back to the physical world and thinking about, okay, well, what do we keep and what do we give back? What do we invent anew? And I'm wondering if you could maybe respond to it from that perspective of being an organizer, being a community builder that has to always be juggling this negotiation of the digital and the physical.
And yeah, I think it's always been really important for us from the very start at MOSFest is that we ask people to put their devices down and be present in the room and understand the people that are here in this space with you, rather than trying to communicate online. And so we are very intentional that we ask people not to work from slide decks or to, to work on their computers, but we ask them, get out the pen and paper. What can we draw? What can we build together? How can we kind of build these conversations by the direct engagement with someone sitting across the table from you? But that's not always possible in a physical space, especially if your community is very global and you're only meeting once a year. How do you drive that connection online as well as online? And I think it's a kind of what Winnie was saying there. It's like, it's really important that we're not recreating that physical when we move online, but it's about not remolding the tools that we have, but like thinking about what's the actual need for us in this moment, and what we understand right now. What are those issues that are facing us in education and in community organizing, and how can we kind of raise to that challenge? I definitely hope, from a personal perspective, it is not the death of the university, but I feel like this kind of space, the university gives you this time to speculate, to be very creative, be very radical in your practice, in that kind of safe area of like learning from each other and learning from others. And I think that's super important in this new reflection that we're about to enter into. And I think giving that space, whether it's physical in a room or offline, is very, very important. So understanding the needs for this moment right now is where it focuses on.
Thank you. And Kat, also, I mean, I think you also come from a deep understanding of, well, communities that have to sort of organize and negotiate across both physical and digital realms, and especially from makerspaces, for example, which are kind of the almost like the exemplar of that sort of community. So yeah, I'm very curious what you have to say about this. Also, feel free to tell us whether you think the university is dead or not.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, it's such an interesting topic because, I've come from sort of open tech community building into sort of research institute spaces. And so now, I'm a research fellow at two research-focused universities in the UK, the University of Sussex and King's College London. But I came from the world of the Mozilla Festival, where we hacked things, we got things done quickly, we gathered when we needed to get those things done, and things moved very quickly, and things were able to be built and sort of communities maintained in it. Like the temporality of those spaces is very fast moving and very rapid, whereas I find the temporality of the institutional sort of university space to be much slower. And I think that since we are all across the bar, whether we're in cultural institutions, universities, or even open tech communities, we're learning that we're losing the physical spaces that we really depended on for these kinds of gatherings, regardless of whether they were fast or slow. But I think it's really providing us with an important opportunity to sort of enable our collective consciousness to sit together on these digital spaces that we have built alongside the physical spaces, and understand how to transform and modify those physical spaces that we've been in so that they can be more open, more participatory. In the case of the UK, I would say what's broken across all universities is that they're becoming more and more expensive to participate in. So more and more people are being cut out of education that I believe we all are entitled to. So, it is giving us a chance as educators and researchers to rethink what the university should stand for, and to hopefully infuse some of the makerspace and Mozilla Festival open spirit into these spaces that have become very closed off. And I don't think they became closed off intentionally. I don't think anyone wanted the universities that we're working with to be spaces where only certain people who can afford to engage in that education get to engage. But I do think that moments of crisis like this, it's a moment that we shouldn't waste, because things do need to change. And we're being provided, as we're seeing with the speakers here, with new models. So, it's up to each of us in our own work and practice to experiment with them.
Yeah, I notice also, I mean, the especially from Soo Ryon and Winnie, I get this impression that, well, basically you get thrown into the situation where you just have to go online and you have to adapt, you have to hack, you have to kind of just figure out something that works. Seda in a previous video even referred to this as the let's get things done moment. Like, let's worry about critique later and let's just make it work. And this is kind of interesting because in a sense, you're on your own as educators. And I think you even referenced this in your video, that you're kind of in a situation where everybody has to figure it out on their own. And I'm wondering, what if there were to be infrastructures that would support this moment, what would they be? What are the needs? What do we need? And I don't think this is one global, like, everybody needs the same thing question. I mean, I'm very curious what you individually would need. And maybe, well, Kat, you're involved in the university, but maybe Sarah, for you, what you think is necessary, what sort of infrastructure do you think are necessary for this sort of, for the new normal to emerge in a way that teachers aren't so overstressed and exhausted, and even students aren't so exhausted. Soo Ryon, you were talking about the bodies of your students already being pushed to their limit. So you really can't even ask more of them at this point anymore. So yeah, I don't know, whoever, I'm leaving this as an open question. If somebody wants to jump in, please go ahead.
I can say something about that. So as you mentioned, it's like, because I actually moved to online like in the middle of the course, maybe, right? And it's actually don't have much time for you to think about what are the infrastructure, what are the video tools that you can use. You just have to think about how to reduce your content, and also to how to create like a less stressful environment online, especially, it's so serious for this pandemic, right? But I think one thing that I have to say that my university is doing pretty good, maybe it's also a reference for other university, I think, is that is really respect faculty who have students or also like difficulty working from home as well. So in that sense, they allow us to rethink about, for example, like you have a physical class time contact hours, like 4 hours slot for the lecture, for example, right? So it is not a must that you have to translate again, right? Are we actually doing just translate exactly that 4 hours to online, right? Or there's a sort of a combination. Maybe it's difficult because you have kids around, so it's also difficult for you to have this kind of like this section, right? So then they are allowed to like record like an hour video, or even not show up online, maybe written instructions or other assignment, instead of like you need to be online teaching the student 4 hours, which is the same. So I think having this flexibility is also really, it's not just only about the students who are stressed. I feel as an educator, I'm also totally stressed as well, in terms of like how to translate, what to translate, how the student feels, how do I feel, and what's the point now teaching this subject, whereas everywhere is such a mess, right? So in a way, we as an educator, we also have to come up like, how do we calm ourselves as well, right? In order to care for others, right? So in that sense, I think institution-wide, having that flexibility, I think is really important. And then when you think about what forms of tools, right, you ask about, or what kind of things that we need for this kind of infrastructure. I actually think like what I find is lacking right now is, of course, like using different tools, right? It's actually not my decision in a way. It's an institution decision. What you have to use, this is the most secure, or this is how it is, right? And at that time, I didn't even have any bandwidth to think about what is the problem with the infrastructure. And also, like even for Zoom, for example, right? It's like there are so many different news. And then you also, as a researcher, you also have to use a lot of energy to analyze whether this news makes sense, or whether they are actually doing okay job, and how is it different from Teams or others, or what are the other possibilities, right? So, but it's also, there's not such a moment for me to dig into this thinking. So what I need, right, I guess it's really like, as a long run, not necessarily this time, is like, what are the other possible tools, also like support by the university or support by the institution or IT, that allow for various forms of discussion, and also like not dictating that we need to use this, right? This is the primary thing that we recommend. Yes, but how about the others? So are you willing to have a dialogue as well to provide more different options to allow cater for different needs of people? I think that's pretty much of mine.
Yeah, in your video, you even mentioned that you requested a server basically from the university IT, just so that you and students could just install different platforms on it and just try them out to see what the affordances were.
And I'm diverted to other team because there's possibly security issue. So it's still like going through some kinds of steps, but I feel it is needed to have different options, at least for us to think about what we are using, right? Not necessarily this is good or this is bad in that kind of binary, right? But to open up various discussion, I guess.
Or just having multiple options immediately creates a discussion about which option to use.
If I may jump in and also piggyback on Winnie's comment, and I cannot agree more with her on the necessity to have a space of discussion, like different dialogues, because while I was teaching, I actually realized I don't necessarily need a lot of infrastructural support for this kind of teaching, because before we transitioned online, I asked the university a lot of things, like, new studio, a technical manager, rehearsal rooms. All of these were sort of in my pocket to kind of throw out whenever I'm in a meeting. After we transitioned, ironically, all of these became, not necessarily important, if not, suspended for the time being. But what I actually did hope it would happen is the space of discussion, because I think there was an assumption, at least on part of the university administrators, that all teaching methods, all types of classes that were being taught at Lingnan were susceptible to or easily translated into online forms. My teaching usually involves one part lecture and the other part performance workshops, where we move around, apply gestures, choreography, theater methods, etc. And my students actually do sign up for my class, specifically for that component, moving around. And so without giving the opportunity to both the faculty members and the students to actually talk about the stressful moment, right? The mourning, the sadness, the pure kind of emotional registers that I got from my students as soon as we kind of transitioned online was sadness. They were really sad to not be able to move around. Even though their bodies were pushed to limits, they still wanted the affordance to move around, at least in the classroom. And so instead, even though the university has actually been very supportive and helpful for this kind of transition, I wish there had been, and there would be, an opportunity to kind of really delve deeper into the discussion around what is needed for performance-based, arts-based, embodied learning and teaching in terms of this particular transition, because everybody's kind of mourning. We are stressed. I had a eureka moment while I was teaching, because I was trying to watch a 2-hour performance online, and I realized I just couldn't sit there and watch a 2-hour session. And then I quickly kind of sympathize with my students how hard it is to take 5 classes a week online. 2 of them would be performance-based, for example. And so I think there should be some sort of town hall meeting, in addition to infrastructural necessity, but town hall meeting, a series of dialogues that can really kind of help the students to kind of process these things. And so that would be my primary need at this point.
I think that's so powerful. What you both mentioned is the acknowledgement of this grieving process that we're all going through, like what we miss from our old day-to-days, and the people, not only just the people we see in our families, but just the small things, the agency you had about being outside and how you lived your life, to the very kind of what in those moments probably felt really like annoying in how we work, that noise, that crowdness, but now it's kind of a solitary practice that we're engaging in. And I think for me, like thinking about what we need, and I know Kat spoke a lot about this in her talk about a new way of being, but I think the first thing we need to do if we think about this new normal is this time for reflection. So what are those emotions that we went through as we changed how we worked and how we engaged with each other, and get feedback from people. So feedback from the educators, feedback from the students. What did it feel like to, be kind of wrangling that technology that you're hoping that will still inspire a conversation? And what does it feel like for the students who are engaging and having to listen to a platform where before it was that beautiful practice of like that physical practice that was so important into that education? I think in this new way of being, it's really important that we give a lot of space for experimentation. Like we don't have to get it right straight away, and we have to be able to continuously be able to evolve, because if we need to look back and get feedback. So every step of that way, we need to be engaging with those people that were working with us. And again, not recreating what went before the 4-hour lecture. Like it's really hard to recreate that moment online. And so what can we do right now? And I think there's also then a final piece I'd say about this is an external factor. And I think the toolkits that you both shared is like, from what I'm hearing your examples here, like universities, but like in so many places I've worked, there's a lot of closed ecosystems, like you can only use certain platforms, you can only access this browser, you can only do it this way. And we have to ask ourselves, why do we put those kind of stringent rules in place? And because it takes away from the creativity and the experimentation. So yes, ask for a server and give the students that option and that power to like build it themselves. But it's also important to remember the external factors of like family life, parents or students working at homes, in crowded homes. We don't have the luxury of these big rooms and these quiet spaces. And we have that, that kind of idea of you're inviting people into this space that is like your home and where you are all of the time right now. And what do people see? How do people want to engage in that and that personal piece? And it also speaks to that kind of that personal ecology. Like we have to be strong to be able to lead our community, and we have to kind of be honest with ourselves when things are quite stressful and we're not getting it right. And by being honest with those we're engaging with online and being like, I'm not sure how this bit's going to go, so we're going to try this breakout room, I think people will respond with a lot of empathy, because it is this new focus, this new order that we're entering in. And I think, yes, let's give space for getting it wrong at the start.
I just one adding point is like would be great to like having. I think the point of like having empathy, not just necessarily about like students and us, but also management from an institutional point of view as well. It's like having empathy. I think it's also this is what Soo Ryon talked about in her talk. The video is like not to expect too much, right? But also from an institution point of view, is like you also have to acknowledge it is not normal. It is not the old thing, right? It's everyone is suffering from different perspective,
Yeah, and everybody is making these hacks as you are. And it sounds like, Sarah, what you're suggesting is there needs to be almost like a rigorous space created for these hacks to continue, for this creativity to keep going, and the empathy, Winnie, that you're talking about, the empathy to know that it's hard.
Yeah, and I think as Soo Jung mentioned it in her talk, where she asked her students to be reflective of the space that they're in right now. And I think that's exactly it. Like in this moment, whether it is true with many of our different practices, is like understanding that we have to kind of evolve for this new physical being, this new way of being.
And I think what everyone is also sort of stating in their own ways here is that top-down approaches will not work well in this current moment, and perhaps going forward they will also not work well. And we're all becoming increasingly conscious at this point, and with the point that the more we consult everyone involved in whatever relation it happens to be, the better it will be for everyone, and the more the digital infrastructures and physical infrastructures that we work with in our practice can be spaces of care and mutual aid, rather than spaces of hegemony, as they have become in many cases. And I think these kinds of conversations now are so essential, and it's also essential that we don't forget them, and that we continue to infuse them and have these sort of critical debates with ourselves and with others about what ways are best, what tools are best, what kind of interactions are best, because otherwise it is almost like we'll go through all of this struggle and then we'll go back to business as usual. But we have the chance to not do so.
Is there anyone else who wants to chime in on that? I'd also like to open up this moment to the audience that's in the chat room. Please, if you have any questions, feel free to shoot them at us, and we'll try discussing them. I've got a bag full of questions, so I'm fine. But it would be nice to not only listen to me, I'm sure. I would like to pose another question to everyone, and I think a couple of you touched on this already. This kind of feeling of grieving and making space to grieve, and I would like to maybe focus a little bit on that for a moment, and think about what has been lost and what you feel is being lost. Not so much from like a romantic perspective, but really to think about, okay, what's being lost, and that gives us a starting point to think about rebuilding. And we were talking about also building a toolkit, and maybe part of that toolkit is also a tactics for recognizing what's lost and grieving for it. So yeah, whoever wants to jump in, please go ahead.
I can start. I think what I take to see being lost is again that empathy piece where not everybody has the same bandwidth or access for online, and so as we are kind of rapidly prototyping and looking for these incredible platforms for us to evolve and organize and educate, and that we don't forget about those people who actually don't have internet in their homes or have like very slow speeds. And so as we kind of rapidly prototype for something that's quite fancy and can do everything, that we are remembering those folks so that they don't get left behind in this kind of future thinking. And I take to see that loss, that sense of reliance in community, and like that we get this done together. And it's the great joy of my work is like having these conversations and like building with the community, building with others, learning from people, and giving that space and time. And we all get this kind of fatigue from being in these meetings, and those kind of casual water cooler moments, or those ideas of kind of little expressions that we kind of lose it in this online life, that we find a way to make sure that they're still part and parcel. We have space for that creativity, for those weird and wonderful shares, or the ideas, and to continue the conversations.
Yeah, I think to sort of add to what Sarah's saying, what's so essential right now is to really think carefully about who is being left behind in our different communities and educational spaces, and why they are isolated or vulnerable, and how we can make them less so from the positions of power that we are in as facilitators, or as educators, or as members of a community. And also how these individuals and groups are probably different, that they're different groups now than they were before. So people who were not necessarily vulnerable in the before times now are, and we need to make sure that they're not left behind. And I think a lot of that is just about, sort of as everyone has been saying here, consulting with those that we're interacting with to see what their needs are, and continuing to consult, because our needs are all changing as well. And our health and economic concerns alone are continually evolving and are continually unstable in so many ways. And this is, I guess, another moment to really reflect on what kinds of tools and digital spaces we build, and who will be invited, and who will feel welcome in those spaces, and who will feel a bit less welcome, and what kind of care they need to feel like they are equal members.
I think for mine is, I'm thinking about like, it's more like a classroom learning setting, like teaching, learning. Some of you also mentioned about like accessibility, whether everyone has equal access, right? And I want to add on like a different point is like the stress level handling of everyone is actually have different degree of how they can take the stress. Because I guess it's, as you might also aware, because stress is something that is quite a big thing here in Denmark, I would say. And the more I'm working here, the more I feel like it's also like to think about like actually students also have their own difficulties in terms of dealing with this situation. Some may be coping better, but some also very difficult, right? But in that sense, then how can we do a little bit more in terms of caring, in terms of less content on teaching, but just maybe spare 10 minutes, for example, for each class, maybe round the table, like have a quick update, how do you feel right now? Or a little bit more like a big announcement email, sort of like to check in for like, I hope you're doing good. Because this is also what I do as well. Because I have a cat, I usually use the cat as a figure to sort of like have a connection with the students. Like, oh, my cat bow tie is actually doing good. I hope you're doing good as well. You know, sort of like think of different ways to create, create a caring environment and initiate the dialogue. As I also observe the online learning and education, I find people are getting more and more passive, especially students, when compared with physical setting. They tend to just listen, you just speak, they tend not to be so much engaged with the activities, right? So in that sense, to think about what other things can open up more dialogues, right? As we don't have the physical touch, right? Physical intimacy, right? Then how can we remember these bodies, materials, right? In order to give a little bit more care and empathy, I guess.
Yeah, all of these points I so agree with, especially what Sarah and Kat sort of earlier on touched upon the issue of accessibility and also the changing sort of ideas of accessibility as we transition to a different mode of teaching, and also forming solidarity with the community. I guess my fear, or what is getting lost in terms of that, I don't so much fear of losing the conventional performance spaces, although I think that's been a lot of anxiety-inducing problem for many practitioners, and that's a very valid concern. However, in my sort of standpoint, I think performance spaces will remain. I think instead, what I fear of losing is my sort of engagement with the student at this point. And I think it kind of pushes me to rethink about, again, right, accessibility, how I approach the students, in terms of expecting them to perform something or do something. And I talked about this in my video, in which I sort of introduced you to how the Hong Kong students, especially in my class, have been refusing to turn on their camera, and also they do not speak up during the synchronous session. And there might be various reasons. I'm sure one of the students might be watching a YouTube video. It's fine. But 99% of them actually, it turns out that they're living, and then Winnie actually sort of mentioned this earlier, but a lot of them are living with their parents in a very cramped apartment, which is the sort of the very common thing in Hong Kong. And then when they're engaging in class, their parents often ask them to help them with cooking or cleaning and homework. And so they're very embarrassed about exposing themselves. Whereas maybe for other students who have the affordance to access a studio space or have a very large room on their own, it might be very easy for them to kind of have this interactive synchronous experience. My students really don't really have that. And so one of the ways in which I've kind of come to kind of cope with that situation, and this is kind of related to Winnie's sort of idea about, less content but more empathy, more sort of different kind of engagement, is that we have to also try to work out a way to humanize ourselves. Like, one anecdotal point is I was teaching a class synchronously one day, and then I had a package delivered to my apartment, and so my lecture was interrupted. And so and then I had to explain to my students that my package was rolls of toilet papers, which were all sold out everywhere in Hong Kong. And so my students immediately kind of empathized with me. I empathized with them. It kind of humanized my particular situation, because I think as educators, we often sort of tend to kind of really put on the professional, performance, if you will, and that is sometimes necessary. But in this particular mode of learning and teaching, and also community building, I think students are, they should be allowed to, and they should deserve to kind of see the moment where each of us kind of can humanize one another through that very ridiculous but mundane and necessary moment of having a roll of toilet papers delivered to my apartment.
We have a comment from someone in the chat room. She's a student from Heidi. It's very connected to what you're all talking about right now. So she says, I currently attend a seminar where we're asked to write and share diaries of our daily experiences, and then reflect on why we felt these experiences are worth noting. So she's a sociology student, and she says this is helpful for her both as an academic, on an academic level, but also on a personal level. And she thinks, oh, so maybe we're kind of substituting physical togetherness of a classroom with emotional togetherness through sharing. And she asks, kind of as an open question to everyone, have you had any other ways of connecting to the personal lives of students, but maybe to others who you work with, into digital spaces? I don't know, Winnie, you already shared the anecdote of your cat and the anecdote about the toilet paper. I don't know if Sarah and Kat, you have any anecdotes like this. Otherwise, we can ask another question.
Yeah, I can. I think I love that idea of like in the class, like the virtual class, writing down and reflecting on your day. I think that is a really nice moment to bring you in, but allow you to bring your whole self there. I think it's very important to start these meetings in these really hard times with that, be together, understand what everyone's going through, because this is affecting us so differently, country to country, like even state to state, and neighbor to neighbor. So giving space for people just even to share the small anecdotes of how their day started, which is very different from our norm or what was taking place 6 months ago. And as an organization, we've done some sweet things, like we, bring your pets to work, where when you be fitting right in, where you can, bring your turtle or your dog and just have this meeting and like introduce and just kind of bring a little bit of element of fun and kind of space to talk about, to be together as friends rather than this kind of drive for the work. And we also do some kind of like moments where also introduce your kids, so bring your kids on. And that's, I don't have any children, but it's always very, very sweet and engaging to see my colleagues young children, and it's very personal moment, and also very lovely to see what that relationship looks like. And then obviously young people in technology is very funny and good to engage with.
I try to, like the last, I think one of the class I did, especially the end of the class, I asked everyone to turn on their camera and then have their dogs, have their tortoise, have their rabbit, have anything that they want to like take a selfie together, And then I took like 2 shots because it's so many people, like 40 people. And then I combine the image and then I send out as another email saying like, this is sort of like our class photo, This is something we used to have in our high school. I think for university, we don't have that class photo concept, right? But I find it's actually quite sweet as well, seeing, like also we understand this is a difficult situation, but also how exactly like really that kind of connection, and also everyone feel being included and feel good enough to show something beyond, beyond something around just work,
Yeah, I think there's so many good ideas here. I feel like I want to write them all down, but I was just thinking about two more. So I've just launched a design research activity, which is it's an open contest, and it actually has a prize of €100, and it's still open if anyone listening would like to participate. And it's called the Derive Drift, and it's inspired by psychogeography, which sort of the situationists and the psychogeographers aimed to invite people to walk through the urban spaces that they engage with every day, but in a new way. So walking down the streets that we commute through with our emotions sort of on our sleeve, to understand how those spaces are impacting us in ways that we don't consciously understand when we're just walking through them sort of subconsciously. And so the activity is asking people to map their local park or their local home environment that they've been confined to during the pandemic, and to map it out while thinking through words like transformation and instability, so that we can understand how the spaces that we have been confined to, I mean, the four walls, whether we're with our family or other people that we love, sort of how the confinement has shifted our perception of ourselves, but also how it's provided us with many new opportunities to rethink sort of our practice, our work, the things that we're learning, and to understand our own resilience, right? So looking through the objects in like the main room of my flat, for example, I realized what objects have given me power, and what objects have sort of made me feel a bit disenfranchised, and it allows me to sort of rearticulate, my engagement with those things. And I was also part of a reading group called The Artist's Way, that sort of engages people in being more creative, and it's sort of a 12-week process of reading through different ways that we can be our most creative selves. And one of the members of this group facilitated a really short activity that was asking us to quickly run across our flat and bring back a piece of clothing that we haven't been able to wear in the last 10 to 12 weeks of quarantine, and that we can't wait to wear as soon as we're out, because we haven't been able to wear it, and it doesn't matter how crazy it is. So I saw some amazing hats and some glittery, sort of capes and different things that probably I would never see in my collaborators on a normal day. And then she asked us to bring an item that we've ended up eating to treat ourselves that we might not be sharing otherwise. And I think these little moments of vulnerability enabled me to learn about the people in my reading group in a really beautiful way. And I will remember them through, the hat or the cape that they shared with me. And I think, like you all said, these finding new ways to share of ourselves, things that we are comfortable with, but that we might not have shared in a typical environment, that kind of gives us collective power. And it does sort of allow us to build solidarity that I think will infuse into our daily lives beyond this crisis.
So many good ideas. Like Kat said, I'll probably have to revisit our video later to kind of write down all of the hacks and tricks. Just to add on to already, this wonderful set of ideas, and thank you for the question, Heidi. I guess in my class, I've adopted what I call DIY performance. Or solo performance rather, where I would give my students a weekly prompt that responds to some of the signature movements or sort of the key gestures that were important to the class discussion. And then I would write down a prompt, or rather a set of questions or instructions that the students could follow to create their own version of performance. And in the process, they would be paying attention to, again, right, their domestic surroundings, what their family members are doing, or even their community, what they're doing within the apartment complex, et cetera. And so in the process, I think the actual performance product isn't necessarily the primary importance, but rather the ways in which the students begin to pay deep attention to, again, some of the things that all of us have already talked about, but really paying attention to their surroundings, in which they haven't necessarily been kind of thinking a lot about what people are doing within that space, within that time. And so that's been kind of one of the practices that I've been adopting in terms of the emotional togetherness rather. And again, an additional anecdotal story, another anecdotal story perhaps is, I remember when I finished one of the classes this term, and our semester is already done earlier this month. And then I was thanking my students for their work, and I appreciate their time, etc. on Zoom, and then everybody all of a sudden started to raise their hands. So there's a raise hand button or option on Zoom, and this is primarily used to ask questions or intervene in the discussion, right? But rather, my students were actually using it to kind of say bye or clap. And so I thought that was a very clever idea to perhaps do a micro hack. Even they weren't necessarily thinking about the hacking moment, but they were really adapting to the situation by using whatever is available to them. And so again, that kind of created a very momentary togetherness, perhaps to borrow Heidi's own expression. So that was also one of the practices or micro hacking moment that we've had.
That's wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Unfortunately, we have to wrap up now. Especially a shame because there's quite a few more very interesting questions in the chat, but maybe you can peruse those at your pleasure. And of course, the discussion will continue. We're going to always leave the email channel open, which is s.ton@artes.nl for continuing a discussion, but also contributing to the toolkit that we're building for educators, administrators, and students to help deal with this moment. I also want to mention to everybody out there that the final module of this series will be released the 30th of May. So this will be module 3 on the topic of connecting people, platforms, and policy. We'll have our guests Jeroen Luters and Fabiola Camuti from Artes, who are currently running a project called the No School Project. And we'll also be visited by Theo Besselink, who is from the Learning Lab here in the Netherlands. And this session will be moderated by Nishant. The live event for this session will be on the 3rd of June, and it will be at 4 p.m. CST. So please come to that. And one more time, thank you to all of our guests. Your input has been wonderful. Thank you for giving your time and your care, and for creating a caring space to have this discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah,
Thank you.